Hi, HRN listeners. We're celebrating our 15th anniversary, and we have a really fun campaign and an ask for you. This 15th anniversary tour is aiming to bring you closer to unique food and music experiences in some of the most exciting cities in America. All the while, we're raising funds to support our work empowering the next generation of food systems storytellers through our fellowship programs. Here's how it works. Donate to HRN and be entered into a raffle in the city of your choice to win a dinner for two at a noteworthy restaurant and tickets for two to a concert at a prominent local venue. We have incredible partners in New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Nashville, Las Vegas, Charleston, Asheville, and Ardmore, Pennsylvania, who have donated a meal for two and two tickets to a concert of the winner's choice. And all donations help fund our fellowship programs, where we're helping to build essential workforce readiness skills and food system storytelling skills. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15. Thank you.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. Since 2009, HRN podcasts have been exploring the wide world of food, beverage, and agriculture. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
This episode is brought to you by 818 Tequila, delicious and smooth tequila made in harmony with the earth. 818 Tequila, imported by 818 Spirits Manhasset, New York. 40% alcohol by volume. Drink responsibly.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host here on Beer Sessions Radio, and it's Tuesday, May 10th, 2022. We'll be talking about unions and working men's clubs and things we haven't really talked too much about on this show. So let's go around the room and introduce each other. So I'm Jimmy Carboni. Gerard?
Hey, I'm Gerard Fagenberg. I'm a freelance beer writer. You can read me in Good Beer Hunting and The Takeout, and locally here in Racket in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
That's great, man. Thanks so much. Last time we had you on, we were talking about your Jack Kerouac article, and that's how we got connected with Pete Brown. So looking forward to talking further. And Dave, my pal.
Hey, yo, thanks for having me. My name's Dave Infante. I'm an independent journalist. I publish Fingers, which is a newsletter about drinking in America, and I contribute as a writer-at-large to VinePair.
That's great. Dave, I've known you a long time, and I know that you don't just cover pints and pours and hops. You for a long time have covered some issues, social issues as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm not actually very into beer in terms of the liquid. I'm much more interested in the culture and the politics and the power that the industry wields and how that works out. So definitely coming at it from a different angle than some of my colleagues.
Well, thanks for joining us. It's going to be a fresh conversation. And Pete Brown, welcome.
Hello, I'm Pete Brown. I'm supposed to be a beer writer, but I keep wandering off the subject. And like Dave, but my original fascination with beer was the role it plays in our culture and in society. It took me a good few years to get more acquainted with the beverage and all the different styles and that kind of thing, which I do love. But beer and pubs in the UK and bars in other countries, I'm fascinated by the social interaction and the roles they play.
Yeah. Well, Pete, so, many of us know some of your beer books. We've had you on a couple of times already. But going back, there was a book about Shakespearean pubs and
yes.
a few others. Why don't you just jog our memory a little bit?
Yeah, so that was there's a book called Shakespeare's Local, which was contentious for some people. The idea was to take one pub and look at it through centuries of history, which in London there's a handful of pubs that all argue about who's the oldest and which was here the first. And none of them are, the same fabric of the building as they used to be. Bits get replaced all the time and that kind of thing. But I was fascinated by the constant role that the pub plays. And there's a pub, the George Inn in Southwark in South London. It's just south of the River Thames. And it's been there since probably the 15th century, 14th, 15th century. And I was fascinated by the footprints, the number of people who've passed through there. Shakespeare used to live just around the corner from that pub. And the Globe Theatre, where he premiered plays such as Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, is kind of 5 minutes walk away. So I argued that Shakespeare must have drunk in this pub. There's no documentary evidence of it. There's no documentary evidence that Shakespeare ever went to the toilet or ate food, but he obviously did. So the fact that there's no documentary evidence doesn't mean he didn't go there. And so I argued like a detective and built the case that he probably did drink there. But not just him, Charles Dickens, Geoffrey Chaucer, a whole bunch of different, Elizabeth Taylor, Beyonce, all these people have drunk in this pub. And most of the time people have gone to the pub have done the same thing. They've drunk the same beer, they've had the same conversations, they've made the same bad jokes, and I just love that continuity through the centuries.
Yeah, you always keep mentioning Geoffrey Chaucer, don't you? There was something you posted in Pellicle magazine about something about Geoffrey Chaucer.
Yeah, so he basically is credited with inventing English literature. He wrote the Canterbury Tales, and he was the first person to use English rather than Latin to try and create serious literature. And the Canterbury Tales is ostensibly a bunch of different people from medieval society who go on a pilgrimage, kind of like the package holiday of the Middle Ages. You go on a pilgrimage to a big cathedral, and it was the proto-tourism of the day. And along the way to Canterbury, they all tell each other tales. There's the knight's tale, the miller's tale, the wife of Bath's tale, the preacher's tale. And there's nothing about the journey to Canterbury at all. That's not of interest. It's the stories they tell each other, and this is Chaucer giving a cross section of society in the late 14th century. And the story begins in a pub. It begins in the Tabard Inn, which was right next door to the George Inn. It was the next building, and stood there till 1876. And the reason Chaucer chose the pub as the starting point, because that was the only plausible place where all these different characters could meet. They would never interact in society normally, but the pub is this level, this place, this everyone has in common, and that's still true today. And that's why Chaucer still is this touchstone for me. English literature was born in a pub because the pub is the place where you see the whole of society.
Wow. Well, that's a great intro. And we're going to lead into your new book, Clubland. Just tell us a little bit about it. But my first question is going to be, why this book? And I know you have a lot to say about it.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. I first wanted to write it when I was writing my first book about the history of pubs and beer in Britain. And there was a kind of a touchstone, which was in 1872, there was a licensing act that limited the hours that pubs were allowed to open for the first time. And this created outrage. Pubs had to close between midnight and 6 a.m. I mean, how outrageous is that? The problem was that private members' clubs, these elite places that MPs, judges, lawmakers drank in instead of pubs, because they were private members' clubs, they were exempted from the laws governing pubs, and people saw this as hypocrisy. They saw it as one rule for the governing classes and one rule for ordinary people. And working men's clubs were 10 years old at that time, and they said, "Hey, well, we're private members' clubs too." And the lawmakers went, shit. And so the working men managed to kind of twist the law and get it to work in their advantage. And the upper classes were absolutely furious. They spent the next 50 years doing everything they could to close down working men's clubs. And that for me was a fascinating story that, we're obsessed with class in this country. And the upper classes did everything they could to regulate the behaviour of the working class as well, exempting themselves from those regulations. And working men's clubs went, "Nah, we're not going to let you do that."
And then, Gerard, when we last talked with Pete, we went into this. I remember thinking, I'd never thought about it too much, but I was like, wow, where I grew up in Massachusetts, there were working men's clubs like Elks clubs, and there were, immigrant clubs like the Italian Garibaldi Club and, the Warsaw Polish Club in Brooklyn.
Knights of Columbus, yeah.
Yeah. What are you thinking about today? Because you're in the town that might be called the City of Unions, Minneapolis, and what are you thinking?
Yeah, I really do appreciate the fact that living here, it does feel like a epicenter of a lot of the modern labor movement in the United States. Actually, I was saying this earlier. That's sort of how I became aware of Dave's writing at Fingers, was him talking about this failed union bid at Surly, and then later a successful one at Fair State. So that happening at the same time, we have Tattersall Distilling fighting for a union, and then other distilleries accepting unions, and then you have Half Price Books first locations in the United States unionizing. In Minnesota, we now have 2, maybe more by the time you hear this, unionized Starbucks. It's just like, it's amazing living in a post-industrial town. You know, I grew up in Massachusetts, but in a town that is not very industrial, but moving to a mill town and seeing this sort of preservation of this working class mindset persisting through time and maintaining its hooks into the modern culture. You know, I live in Powderhorn Park, which for all intents and purposes is the workman's heart and soul of the city. We just passed May Day, and it is a huge celebration here in my neighborhood. I feel like I've been awakened to this. So I think it's amazing to see this happen while my own working class consciousness is opening. And I also have to thank Pete for educating me so much on what happened in England to really lay the foundation for everything that's happening here. It's like, I feel like Pete knows more about this stuff than I know about anything. So it's always so enlightening trying to find a juxtaposition for that.
Yeah. So, and Dave, the next step goes to you. I mean, you've been writing about unions. You were on a podcast with Kim Kelly. Why unions? What happened to the craft beer, and everybody was welcome. Everyone was part of craft beer. Why are unions coming up now?
Man, I mean, I think there's a bunch of reasons. As with any, social and political movement, there's not just one inciting incident, but the craft beer industry in the U.S. is maturing. It has, slowed in its growth over the course of the past decade, and really has started to kind of find its footing as an adolescent category. It's not, it's not a bubble. It's not going bust in the way that maybe some people thought it would be midway through, the 2010s, but it's, it's grown up, so to speak. And as the industry has grown up, workers have, realized, like, man, we've got some things that we really like. We love this industry. We love making beer. We love, the lifestyle that comes with it for the most part, but the working conditions kind of suck. And a lot of times they really do. The health insurance, if it exists through a brewery, is deficient and, hard to afford. The work is often quite physical if you're in the production side of the brewery. It's often very unrewarding if you're, in the tap room, where you're dealing with unruly customers and you're on the front lines. And certainly during COVID, we saw, tap rooms employees realize that they were getting the raw end of the deal there. I've been interested in covering unions mostly because I worked at Thrill. When I was working at Thrillist, I helped to organize Thrillist Union. We organized a digital media union with the Writers Guild of America East, which is, a big digital media organizer that first kind of got into the space, organizing Gawker, rest in peace. But, as I was starting to become more class conscious and understand the dynamics between labor and capital and how they affected me in direct and indirect ways, I started applying that lens to the thing that I covered, which is, the beer industry and craft beer specifically. And I was, the question that I asked myself, I think in 2018 or so, when I wrote this story for Splinter, was, where are all the craft brewing unions? Brewing in this country has a long history of organized labor. The Teamsters represent a lot of workers at macro breweries across the country, but the craft beer industry, because it's so atomized, because it's so sort of fractured as a marketplace, there's 9,000 breweries in the country, whatever, it has not been an organizing target for the labor movement in this country, which has been, on its haunches for 40 years, basically ever since 50 years, ever since, Reagan broke the PATCO strike and started the, wealth inequality spiral that we're all living through today. So taking some of the big themes that,
Dave, there's a lot of new themes there that many of us haven't thought about. Is organizing, is it differ state by state, or are some states easier to organize in?
I think so. I mean, to Gerard's point, like Minneapolis and Minnesota are, hotbeds of labor. The craft beverage sector in Minneapolis is organizing really effectively and thoughtfully, thinking about that industry together, and figuring out like strategies that apply to breweries and distilleries and craft coffee shops. And you can do that when there's kind of a common understanding of the basic mechanics of how organized labor works. Until recently, I was based in South Carolina, which has the lowest labor union density in the country. To the extent that any Americans are class conscious and, understand, the dynamics of organized labor, the South is at the back of that line. I mean, for a bunch of reasons that are by design, basically dating back to Reconstruction after the Civil War. Labor in the South has been aggressively suppressed, and so it's much harder to organize in a place like South Carolina than it is in a place like Minnesota or New York or California, where the ILWU is still strong there. So geographically it's definitely different. I mean, I don't want to take anything away from the organizers who do organize in Minneapolis. Like, the bottom line is it's not easy to organize anywhere in the U.S. So it's kind of a race you don't want to win, to be the hardest place to organize in. But certainly if you had to name a location in the U.S., the Southeast would be it, in terms of the challenges that exist there that are historical and political.
Great. Well, that's a great intro. Now back to Pete. So we were at 1872 in the UK.
Yeah, it was an interesting time. The British Empire was at its apex at that point. We owned, I don't know, a third of the world, a quarter of the world, whatever it was, and the propaganda was that this was the greatest, richest empire the world had ever seen, and people in Britain felt like they were part of this. And when you look at it from a working man's perspective, we had the greatest navy the world had ever seen. And the guys in Newcastle had built those ships. The guys working in the Sheffield steel mills had made the steel that built those ships. The guys in the cloth mills in Lancashire had clothed the workers. The people in Coventry had made the bicycles that those workers went to work. In Yorkshire, where I grew up, we'd mined the coal that powered the furnaces. So everyone felt like they were collectively part of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. And then they realised that all these great riches, no one was seeing a cent of it. Working people were living in abject poverty. They were working insane hours. Children were working in mines for 12-hour shifts every day, pulling rail trolleys full of coal back up to the surface. And it was like, we're not getting our stake here. And so the union movement was very strong, and the clubs were a big part of that, organising. Where I live now in East London, this was a hotbed of what were then radical clubs. And they would get speakers in to talk to men and educate them, all that aspect of class consciousness. And from the outside, people would say, well, these guys are just going to these clubs, they're getting drunk, they're doing all sorts of obscene things, we need to shut them down. And the real thing that was happening was, no, we don't like the fact that Labour is organising. But everything that people threw at the clubs and the unions and everything else, the working men proved that they were smart. And they found ways around new regulations. They found ways to organise. They found ways to collectivise. And it's only one aspect of the Working Men's Club story, but it's a hugely important part of it.
Yeah, and we're going to walk it back a little bit. Was there a difference between pubs and working class clubs?
Yes, so the pub it's quite interesting. Pub obviously is short for public house. Anyone can go in, and a private members club, by definition, is one where you have to be a member to get in. And in order to be a member, you would have to be nominated by two existing members. And so legally, the police had no jurisdiction over private members clubs because of that licensing act I mentioned, and this drove people mad because you could regulate pubs, you could go in there, you could close them down, and with clubs, it was just like, we have no idea what these working men are getting up to when they're in there, and we were kind of going through a kind of. I think Christianity at that point was fairly fundamentalist, and the church was saying, well, the people in these clubs are infidels. That's a word that they use. We now associate it with radical Islam, but this is what radical Christianity was calling these people, and they said, they're satanic. They're evil. They're getting into all kinds of things, and people. Well, what kind of things? Well, we don't know because we can't get in, but it must be bad.
Well, why didn't they proliferate more? Why were there pubs at all? I mean, I know even now, if I'm in my hometown in Massachusetts, I can go into an Elks Club with a member, or the Garibaldi Italian Club. I can get $2 beers.
Yeah.
Why guys can play cards? Why would I go to a public place at all if I could get drinks that are cheaper to begin with?
Well, that's absolutely the case here. There was no profit motive. So you could buy beer at the same price as the pubs and sell it more cheaply. And when you did make a profit, that profit went back into the community. They created scholarships for working class men to go to Oxford University. They built convalescent homes on the coast for men who grew old and infirm. They organised trips for children to go to the coast, to the seaside. And they became real huge community assets. And at one point, I think at their peak, working men's clubs accounted for about 20% of all the licensed premises in the UK. 4 million British people were members of clubs, and they generated a lot of entertainment. When commercial television first appeared in the UK, they went to the clubs and picked the best comedians, the best singers from the clubs, and they formed the basis of our televised entertainment for about 40 or 50 years. The problem was they didn't keep pace. The fact that they were exclusive to men became increasingly an issue. Women didn't have equal rights in clubs until 2007. There were a lot of allegations of racist behaviour and colour bars. And then when leisure started to kind of evolve and adapt and change, and our homes became more comfortable, the clubs just did nothing. They didn't change, they didn't adapt. And so for about the last 40 years, they've been in quite sharp decline.
Yeah, maybe half the problem is that people watch TV at home and can drink at home. I don't know.
Yeah.
One thing the last book you wrote during the pandemic, it was called Craft. And I see the connection from craft to Clubland. I think about a value to our work. You wrote about the carriage maker who knew the exact width of the wheels to fit into the grooves on the road that had been. Did researching that book, did that kind of help you lead to Clubland?
It really did. I write, I mix quite a lot of different genres in my writing. I look at a lot of history. I do a lot of travel. I do a lot of personal experience. And increasingly, I put quite a lot of memoir into my work, which I'm not quite sure where it comes from. It just appears there. And what Craft did, that was the book is called Craft and Argument. And rather than it being a story, it was a polemic. It was an argument. It was like, I'm going to prove these three things to you. Point one, this. Point two, this. And that's really bled into Clubland because the people who remember working men's clubs kind of treat them as a little bit of a joke. It's like, in the 1970s, you had chicken in a basket and you watch these dreadful comedians, and it's all what working class people did. And now we're more aspirational, and now we all want to be middle class, and we all want to be wear designer label brands and eat sushi and this kind of stuff. And working class culture is often derided as a bit of a joke. And the idea of the book was to say, no, there's definitely humour in the story, but you're not laughing at the clubs and the people who went to them. You're laughing with them, and and there's a very, very serious undertone underneath it, which is that it shaped our culture and gave lots of people huge advantages. And thanks to the clubs, working class people got positions in parliament and local councils, local government, things like that for the first time.
Wow, that's a great intro. Gerard, you sent me a list of union breweries that you know of. You want to talk a little bit about that and then how you met Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one brewery that everyone talks about that's here in Minneapolis and St. Paul actually is Fair State. And, they unionized in 2019 and are still to this day the smallest union brewery in the country. And I think that fact is actually really interesting. I think it ties in really closely to what Pete was saying with this idea of craft is that, most of the union breweries in the country are large breweries, and most of the beer that's made in the U.S. is actually union made, but it's made by companies we don't associate with craft, because I think the way that this sort of working class mentality mutated in the United States was that it became a mythology. And the idea was that, you're working with your friends are looking out for you. You don't need to formalize things like sick time or paternity leave or even, defined working hours. But the companies that are the largest are the ones that have done the best job. I mean, with one, I can tell you about really maintaining labor through time. And I think there's a scale that is at work here where it's like once a brewery gets to a certain size, you basically need a union in order to operate equitably. And so the beer that I'm drinking today is not from Fair State, although I did just finish a Fair State beer during this, but I'm drinking a Shell's from the August Shell Brewing Company, founded in 1860, second oldest brewery in history. They've been union for a really, really long time now, I think since the 40s. And, because they're the, 25th or so largest brewery in the country, the second largest brewery in Minnesota, people don't really see them as a craft brewery, and then they lose some of the cachet that comes along with that. But I think it's an incredibly valuable thing that this is a union-made brewery done on a local scale. And this is really what laid the groundwork for other breweries to look and say, hey, we could do this, and for people at Fair State to say, Shell's has been doing this for 60 years. Why can't we be a union brewery? So I'm drinking their No Frills Pils, which is about the most Shell's beer I could have ever asked for, a German Pilsner, and it's delightful. I'll drink 6 without taking a breath.
Cheers. And Dave, you just keep talking about unions, man. Tell us the story of one brewery or distillery that's on your mind right now.
Man, there's certainly, obviously, there's always union drives. Right now, we're seeing a lot of momentum, actually not in the beer space, but in the coffee space. One of the big stories dominating headlines in the U.S., mainstream publications even, is the wildfire organizing that's happening at various Starbucks chains. Now, whether you think Starbucks is craft coffee or not, their influence on craft coffee and third wave coffee and barista culture is undeniable. That's where a lot of people who go on to own third wave coffee shops, and roasteries and whatever get their training. So it's not. I like to think about, and I think it's important to think about, not siloing beer as the liquid, but looking at the way an organizer might, looking at who has like experiences, like job roles and tasks that they do, and who can make common cause with one another. And I think that's why the organizing in Minneapolis has been so successful, is because it's not just brewery workers or distillery workers or coffee workers. It's all of them using the techniques that they have had success with, to apply that to their own shops. What Gerard said about, Fair State, I think, Fair State and its workers have done a really good job over the course of their union drive and then, their contract negotiations and ratifying their contract, of really communicating what that process has been like. And you can't overstate the effect that bad education and misinformation about the labor movement has had on rank and file workers in this country. I mean, we come up through a school system that dramatically underplays the role of labor. We don't learn about a lot of labor history. Our corporate media is heavily inflected with a pro-business, perspective and framing when they cover labor, and they don't always even bother to cover it, although that is certainly changing. As far as a specific brewery that's on my mind. I'm not currently aware of a drive going on at a craft brewery. I could be wrong, or maybe there's one about to start. You never know. I mean, these things have to happen clandestinely at the beginning, because even though the U.S. has labor law, unfortunately, it's very toothless, and it is heavily slanted to, in favor of the employer. So you wind up, seeing people get fired in at-will states, not for organizing, but for something else, supposedly. It's not that there isn't organizing happening. I'm sure there is. I know there is. It's just that I'm not sure that there's one currently going on at a brewery. There was a big drive in Nashville at Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery earlier this year that ended up in a pretty, it was a big loss ultimately. The union, they organized with the UFCW, and they, were wanted to organize the distillery, and they wound up having about 80% of union cards signed, which is an indication from the workers that they're, they want a union. So 80% of the workforce said they wanted one. And in the time between going public with the drive and, the election being taken, because the company refused to voluntarily recognize the union, the company was able to flip that ratio pretty substantially. The vote was wound up being heavily against the union. Losses are tough and they sting, and you hate to see it for workers who put their heart and soul into the drives. What those losses, and you can't make, I don't know the specifics of how they were organizing, so I can't speak to whether or not they, that's on them. But generally speaking, when you see losses for unions, whether it's in the brewing space, the craft beverage space, or just generally, you always have to remember that these are massive uphill battles that workers are fighting because the law is against them, because capital is against them. It's just something that you got to always take with a grain of salt. That doesn't mean a loss isn't a loss. It is, and it sucks, and that's the deal. But, when we evaluate the strength of the labor movement, we must also evaluate the ways in which it's been legislatively handicapped over the past half century.
Wow. So we're talking about things that most people haven't talked about in a long time. And that's Dave Infante, the editor-publisher of It's Fingers. We're going to be back in a few minutes on Beer Sessions Radio. All right.
I'm Chava Periban, co-host of Agave Road Trip on HRN, here to talk about 818 Tequila. 818 creates their tequila using traditional methods at a family-owned and operated distillery in Jalisco, Mexico. From the blue agave they grow to their recycled glass bottle, 818 emphasizes the earth's importance in all they do. Their distillery runs on biomass and solar power, which means they don't rely as much on fossil fuels and are able to reduce their carbon footprint. Their labels, corks, and boxes are all certified by the Forest Stewardship Council as coming from sustainably managed forests. 818 is a proud member of 1% for the Planet, through which they support HRN as well as Sacred, my organization in Jalisco, where together we transform agave byproducts and water waste into adobe bricks that are donated to local infrastructure projects, like a local library in Zapotitlan de Vadillo. Visit drink818.com to learn more about their sustainability efforts and find 818 near you. 818 has been part of so many magical nights for me, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. 818 Tequila, imported by 818 Spirits, Manhasset, New York. 40% alcohol by volume. Drink responsibly.
Hey, welcome back to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. Join us and become a member at heritageradionetwork.org. Over 30 shows weekly about food, farming, chefs, drinks, and craft beer and cider on heritageradionetwork.org. So Pete Brown's new book, Clubland, is coming out. Pete, why the joke about chicken in a basket? I want to know, you're talking about these working men's clubs. What were some of the features? Do they have special drinks? What's chicken in a basket? We don't know the joke. So
it kind of goes back to, there's a big club called Batley Variety Club, which was about 10 miles away from where I grew up, and basically, this guy, James Corrigan, came to Vegas and went to all the Vegas supper clubs, saw how they worked, and said, I'm going to open a Vegas-style, Las Vegas Strip-style club in the north of England. And all these stars who we saw on TV were basically on the doorstep of all these miners and mill workers, and they could go and see them. And the model for how the club worked was the ticket price was low, and the acts were paid for by the money taken over the bar and the scale of it. And so all the prices were low, but it was like the sheer numbers of people made it work. So chicken in a basket was basically some fried chicken and some fries, and you could have chicken in a basket or scampi in a basket, and those were with the basket is a wicker or a plastic basket lined with a couple of pieces of towel, paper towel. And that's the food offering that you get in this club. And that is it. And you can drink beer, and that is it. So it was a very simple economic model that relied on loads and loads of people buying it. And it became a cliche. It became a byword for the simple tastes of the working class. It became this kind of 1970s thing of, oh, well, we're all beyond that now. We all have much better taste now. And it was kind of demonized. But you know what? It was great. And it was simple, and it worked. And it meant that in these really poor industrial towns, we had stars like Shirley Bassey, Eartha Kitt, Roy Orbison, people like this coming to play these northern working class towns because of the money that they made from this very simple fare.
So you said that there was. Let's talk about class consciousness, and people had ambition. You know, that they didn't want to just be poor, and they wanted to have better lives. How is that different from the current generation that's like aspirational middle class?
I think the big thing is there's a great book by a guy called Richard Hoggarts that was published in 1957. He grew up in a suburb of Leeds in the north of England and managed to get a scholarship to a good school because he was so bright, and became a sociology professor and writer. And he writes beautifully about, in the mid-20th century, in working class communities, there was this idea of us and them. And us was people like you, who you knew. They lived quite by you locally in the streets like yours. You worked in the same factories or the same mines. You drank in the same pubs and clubs. And anybody who said, you know what, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to do something better. I'm going to improve myself. They were seen as with some suspicion. Where I grew up, was like, oh, is living in a small two room terrace not good enough for you? Then is it? You've got fancy ideas, have you? And there was this idea that if you wanted to improve or better yourself in the wrong way, that you were betraying your class identity. And one of the things in the book is that's something I was guilty of when I was 18. I thought, I want to get out of this place. I want to be middle class. And the book is kind of partly me reconciling myself with my working class roots and revisiting that thought. So yes, there was this sense that we want to get better, that we want to better things for everybody. But in this sense that the unions, it had to be better for everybody. It had to be better collectively. If one person's going to break ranks and say, "Well, screw you guys, I've got an escape route here," then that was seen as a kind of class betrayal. And I think today that sense of us has been replaced by the sense of I. If we look at TV commercial advertising and this aspirational sense, it's like, you're special, you're individual, you're worth it, you're better than everybody else. And so certainly here in our post-union, post-industrial Britain, we don't have that collective sense of class identity in a very visible, practical, everyday way. And it's very much, and social media really enhances this. It feeds this sense of narcissism that it's all about not what unites me with people like me, but what makes me different and more special than people around me. And it's quite toxic, I think.
And then just sports and the role of sports in all these things. Kind of old school soccer clubs and the fans and that culture versus the new like the rise of the NFL, American football. How are those fans different, and how are people interacting differently?
It's a great example of a typical story. So actually, so soccer was created as a way to take working class men out of the pub. And when it was originally developed, the idea was it's countless examples of things like this where upper middle class people decide what's best for working men and try to implement it. So the idea of soccer, the way we play it, was, well, go along and appreciate the physical and aesthetic beauty of your local club. And of course, you get 40,000 working men going from the factory to the game, and they get quite tribal. They start to support their team. And so the team has to start playing to win the game instead of produce beautiful football. And so it actually encourages this sense of tribalism, the sense of class identity. And so all the kind of big philanthropists, some of them well-meaning, some of them not, go, no, you weren't supposed to enjoy football like this. You were supposed to enjoy it the way we wanted you to enjoy it. But it was seen as a very working class pursuit. It was looked down upon. It had no intellectual worth. All this kind of footballers were stupid. All these kind of stereotypes. And then, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, it got hit with this big problem of football-related violence, and the English internationally have a dreadful reputation for going to other countries and creating rioting, creating violence and stuff. The British press goes along to these things and buys drinks for football fans to get them drunk and goad them into violence, so that they can then splash it across the newspapers and say, look at these thugs. And in the early 90s, a middle-class writer called Nick Hornby wrote a book called Fever Pitch and said, actually, football's really great. It is this physical beauty. It is an aesthetic pursuit. And he supported Arsenal and in North London, the nearest football club to me. And suddenly all these middle-class people start going to Arsenal to watch the game. Isn't the footy great? Isn't it wonderful? It's great. And then we got the Premier League, and suddenly football wasn't a working-class pursuit anymore. Working-class people can now no longer afford to get into football games. And it's exactly the same with baseball in the States. It's if so many of the tickets, some of the seats are kind of corporate seats with corporations taking their clients along, and there's this phrase of we're not allowed to have anything nice. If working class culture produces something that does have broader worth, then it's kind of the middle class people go, well, we'll have that, thank you very much, we'll take that from you.
Wow, man, this is going deep. Gerard, I'm going to go back to you. Fair State, you told me about Fair State. Wow. Sometimes I feel like we don't know anything. I mean, I want to drink my beer, but I feel like this is an eye-opening conversation. Thank you, Gerard.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there's so many ways we can go. I think we've definitely gone really wide on the topic, but I think the point of class consciousness is really, really important. And I think what Fair State has done is they've really shown people that you can organize and you can be a labor-friendly organization. There can be a management team that openly accepts the union bit of its employees, and there is actually no negative effect on the consumer, which is what everyone says. I spend probably too much time on the Nextdoor app, and you see people every time there's a Starbucks unionization, people get on there saying, well, this is the end of Starbucks. The coffee is going to be $15 and whatever. I think people just don't really understand anymore.
So what are the key things that people want? Because you hear about like just proper schedule, or, pay and benefits are one thing. Actually, my daughter goes to college in Iowa at Grinnell College, and the student workers there actually just formed the first all-college student union. So there's a lot to learn. I mean,
that's another really big arena for that. You see it happen with grad students a lot too. And I think a lot of that is, academia is super primed for abuse of power. It happens left and right. And I think the number one thing that anyone who's in a union wants is protection from retaliation. And these are people, I talked to very recently for Good Beer Hunting, I talked to two of the union stewards for Fair State, Alicia Bird and Ian Sutherland, and they both told me, I've been working in hospitality my entire life, and there was never a situation where you could go to management and say that this person came in and made me uncomfortable and feel confident in that because that person might be a friend of the owner. It was just like, it was a situation that is primed for harassment, and that having the union protection means that you can't be retaliated against for coming forward for speaking out, for, saying, it's not fair that we're treated this way. And in this sort of reckoning that happened last year, so many of the abuses were like, people who are friends with ownership and are nice to the manager, and yeah, they might be groping the bartenders at night, but there's nothing you can do to stop that. Well, all of a sudden you have a structure that can help solve that issue, and it's a structure that looks after itself. It is free of the influence and separate from management, but it is by nature confrontational, sure, but it is not an unproductive confrontation. The confrontation is always productive. And I think that we as consumers, we should take our class consciousness and we should demand that of the things that we consume. And, I think looking at Amazon and saying, we don't want Amazon to unionize because we don't want our goods to get more expensive. That is like a crazy line of thinking. We should be able to have both. And so that's why I think, convenience and ease, and back to what Pete was saying, this sort of individual prosperity, thinking I need to be able to maximize what little money I have, therefore I can't support a business that's going to properly compensate their workers it's an illusory thing. It doesn't make any sense, because the issue is not that these companies aren't making enough money to pay their workers, is that there's no structure that's holding them accountable. So I think when you prove it on a very small scale in a brewery the size of Fair State, or in, at Grinnell College, it's very, very productive for people to see that functioning effectively and working for everybody except for executive leeches.
So yeah, union's a little different than just talking about increasing the minimum wage then.
I mean, that's certainly part of it. And I think, like you said, Jimmy, like fairness in your schedule, that's all there, but it's done within, those things can exist outside of unions, but within a union structure, you're so much more protected. And I think the reason why we're seeing it come to this precipice, intrinsically related to the COVID pandemic, where you have places saying, yeah, you're shit out of luck for a job. Sorry, go find it, regardless of years of service, what you've contributed. The turnover in the hospitality industry is such that people always thought it was not necessary to give people the tools to make a career out of it, which is, it doesn't make any sense. Society persists on the work of working class people. So therefore you need to make these jobs such that they can be a career. And it's not a sustainable model to have people churning in and out of these jobs and have this mythology that you only work as a waitress or a bartender so that you can transition into a middle class and then upper class job. It's just not the way the world works.
Service and hospitality is an important job. We all know what it is when we get it, and we don't get it, we're disappointed. So I guess this is the right track. Hey, Dave, you did a cool interview. So there's actually a woman who's regularly writing about unions for teens.
Sort of, yeah. Kim Kelly. I like that description. I like the idea that's like her sole gig, and it's a predominant gig for her. Kim Kelly is a independent journalist and a new author of a book called Fight Like Hell, which I highly recommend. I read it. I enjoyed it. I recently had her on the Fingers podcast. What you're referring to, Jimmy, is she's a columnist at Teen Vogue, where she writes about the labor movement. She's also been published at The Nation, The Real News, New Republic, I think, in the past. She used to be a correspondent for NPR. She'd been all over the map as a freelance journalist. She actually also, prior to the labor movement, covered the heavy metal space. So she was a music journalist prior to this. But she got into labor over the course of the past 5 years or so. Kim's great. We had a really interesting conversation about her experience researching some of the lesser known or lesser covered facets of the American labor movement. Certainly this stuff has been written about academically, but as I mentioned before, it's very difficult to get labor education into the mainstream discourse in America. So Kim's book, I think, is a great kind of way to smuggle that conversation into the mainstream, and I wish her the most success with it. I think like the thing with journalism about labor and with the work that Kim does is that it's so essential to connect it to issues that resonate not just with the choir that you're preaching to, but resonate with people outside of the labor movement, people who are skeptical of unions, people who maybe have had misinformation fed to them about unions. I mean, Gerard is right on with a lot of his points, and I think those points that he's made and that I've made and that Pete's made, like, those resonate certainly with people who are familiar with the movement. But you also have a vast majority of people in this country who either are neutral on the issue or are actively hostile to American labor, organized labor, I mean. And part of that's because of the atomization that Pete described. And you can blame technology, you can blame social media, you can blame private equity coming in and scooping up businesses and tearing them apart and ruining towns and all that shit. It's all involved for sure. And I don't think the labor movement is the only antidote to that problem, but I do believe it's a part of it. But to get there, you have to have these conversations with people who are not convinced. You have to preach to the unconverted, right? And work like the book that Kim has published, work like the journalistic coverage that is being produced over at Vice, which has a really good pair of reporters on the labor beat, and I'm blanking on both of their names right now. Shame on me. Dave Jamieson at Huffington Post, Stephen Greenhouse, a longtime New York Times labor reporter who is now independent. This stuff injects this conversation into the mainstream, and the reason I like covering this from the beer angle is beer is something that everyone, well, most people at least, are familiar with, and most people have, again, I guess not everyone, but most people have positive opinions of. People have this emotional connection to the product, right? Like, you drink beer when you're happy, you drink beer when you're sad. It's a cause for celebration, a cause for solace. And taking that emotional connection to the product and taking it one step further in understanding who the people are that make it is partly what the original pitch of craft beer was, right? Like that is not a foreign concept in the American craft beer world. I mean, that was partly the way they differentiated themselves from the macro brewers in the 80s and 90s, right? It's like, you don't want a corporation making your beer. You want the guy down the street to make your beer. We're better. We care about the environment. We care about the community, et cetera, et cetera. There's a way to take that message, which I think it's at its core, or at its outset, was mostly true. Whether it's true now, across 9,000 breweries, I'm a little bit more skeptical, but there's a way to take that message and layer on the conversation about labor, right? I mean, labor is people who work in the community. Labor is people who care about the product that they're canning and sending to market. So getting that conversation in the mainstream requires work by journalists, work by organizers, and it also requires, looking for the right avenues to have that discussion. And I do think that beer is one of them.
Great. And Dave, there's a beer I'm supposed to ask you about, so you can mention one beer.
I wanted to shout out Industrial Arts Metric Pills. Industrial Arts is up in, I think they're in Suffern, New York. They're in kind of like Rockland County area, New York. And I've been drinking a lot of their beer lately. I just think it's a really terrific Pilsner, and not to be, the fucking beer Twitter guy who's like ranting and raving about how no one appreciates Pilsners, but I do appreciate Pilsners. I enjoy it quite a bit. And I highly encourage you, if you can find it at your local shop, to go pick some up, because it's real good.
All right. Now, Pete, so in Clubland, what were some of the beers that people were drinking at these work? I want to call them service clubs, but they're working class clubs.
Yeah, service clubs were a subset of them. They were kind of part of that broader movement. The beer's got a notorious reputation. So at the time the clubs were really growing, the brewers in the UK owned most of the pubs. They were tied pubs. And so on the one hand, they saw clubs as a threat to their business. But on the other hand, they were a potential new market. So they had this ambivalent idea about clubs. But clubs were always back of the queue. And so the club men would do what they did with everything and say, well, if people are going to mess us around, we're just going to do it ourselves. So the clubs started to open their own breweries. There's this this brewery called the Federation Brewery that was in Newcastle upon Tyne. And they used to brew this beer in huge quantities and sell it to the clubs. The clubs had massive tanks in the cellar, and the beer would arrive in industrial tankers and just get piped into these huge tanks. And then it would just go out over the bar. I found this wonderful quote. So Barnsley, the town where I grew up, was a big coal mining town. And this guy goes in from another town, and he's sitting in the club main bar. And he thinks the barman's having some kind of breakdown because this guy's the only guy in there. And the barman's just pouring pints of beer and lining them up on the bar until there's 100 pints of beer on the bar and it's still going. And then the whistle at the pit goes, and 30 seconds later, 100 miners storming through the door. They go to the bar. They've been down in the coal mine, the coal dust all down their throats. They each pick up a pint, down it in 5 seconds, slam the glass back down, and bugger off again out the bar. So it's like it was part of industry. It was part of the lifestyle. It was kind of the right of people to get this cheap beer. It's got a bad reputation, but when you go back through the books, this beer won a lot of awards in the 70s and 80s. So I think it was pretty decent beer.
So Federation, and then did they only have that beer in the clubs, or were there?
Not exclusively, but that's like chicken in a basket. It's kind of the notorious thing that everyone remembers about clubs. But the beers would be traditional British bitter, brown, malty, 4%. It was designed for being able to drink in large quantities. I was just talking to someone today about session beer, and the American need to define what session beer is in terms of ABV and style and that kind of thing. To a British pub or club goer, session beer was any beer that you can drink a lot of in a session, whatever strength it is. Yeah, it's probably going to be a low strength beer, but we have this pint culture. Especially in working class areas. And when I was 18, back in the 1980s, there was this idea that a proper drinker was someone who could drink 10 pints of beer and then walk home in a straight line. Being a working class man was about being able to drink a lot of alcohol, but hold it and be in charge of it. You can pick. You can. That's definitely a problematic attitude now, I think, but it's certainly the one I grew up with.
And a proper pint. What was the size of a proper pint?
Yeah, so we have a slightly different pint than you guys. Your pint is 16 ounces. Our pint is 20 ounces. So
and it's a finer glass too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow. This is really going a lot deeper than I thought. I'm going to go back to some social messaging since we're all drinking. I'm drinking a what the hell am I drinking now? I can't even remember. I've been drinking Exhibit A Brewing out of Framingham, Massachusetts, because I like their attention to detail, and I think they do a really nice job of working with their staff. But the beer is damn good. It's called Danko. It was limited, made from some Danko rye that my friend Tor Esner up in Finger Lakes, New York, raises as a specialty grain. So, veterans, working class culture in America, and Pete, you might have something to say about this. It still exists, and I'll tell you when I see it, especially when I'm in working in middle class areas, the veteran culture in America is amazing. I was at a comedy show the other night, and the comics I wanted to call out who's a veteran, and then they asked them to say where they served. And I feel like the commonness of veterans, many of whom are working and middle class people, because of that's who goes to the military often, that seems like it echoes what a union membership would have been in the old days. Does anyone want to run with that? I just thought of it this minute. So you don't know if you know what I'm talking about, Pete. Gerard or Dave?
I don't know if I quite follow, Jimmy.
Okay, it's more like there's a lot of veterans in this country who serve together, and they have a commonality, but many of them are working class people because that's often who goes into the military. And when they get out and they're older, it's still something that ties them together. And there are clubs like VFWs and AMVETs that welcome them. But there is a commonality, and I'm trying to see, is there any other commonality that people have in this country without a union sometimes it's you like the same sports team, but that's not the same.
Right. I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, yeah, like organizing can take place along other trajectories besides labor, right? Like you can make common cause outside of the context of work, and certainly something like all serving in the military together might give you a good kind of like fecund like target for organizing, but it would be organizing with a cause in mind, right? You don't just organize for the sake of organizing. Typically what motivates people to make common cause with one another to take action is something to take action against. I mean, you see that to some extent in this country with veterans who, I'm thinking of one example is like veterans who showed up at Standing Rock to aid the indigenous peoples in protesting the Keystone XL pipeline a few years ago. There are various veterans organizations designed to put pressure on lawmakers to pass reforms for the VA. Like, it's not that organizing doesn't happen amongst veterans, and certainly your point about the working class being overrepresented in the American military is, I think it's an important thing to note, and a lot of the reason for that is because we as a country have tied health insurance and have tied education to the best way for someone without prospects or economic means to get those things is to join the military, which I think is fairly sinister personally. But it's certainly there can be organizing in outside of the context of work. There can also be organizing in community neighborhood organizing and organizing along religious lines. I mean, we're seeing the probable repeal of Roe versus Wade, and that is the fruition of a half century of frenzied organizing amongst the religious right in the U.S. So it's labor is not the only thing that can underpin organizing. It's about making common cause, and labor just happens to be something that a lot of people have in common.
Yeah, Dave, I would say the area where those overlap, like between the solidarity of the military, the solidarity of the working classes, and class stability and class mobility, right? And both options, working in a solid union that can, provide for you for years, or going to the military, the idea is that you can get the benefits that you need to carry you through a life and raise a family and give you what you need, and maybe even potentially ascend, get the skills that you need to get out of your station in life. My grandfather was an Army Ranger, and my dad was a union elevator tech and worked at the Wonder Bread factory. And, my grandpa wanted my dad to never have to go into the military, so he went into the military. And my dad wanted me to never have to work in a factory, so he worked in the factory. And I think that's where you get the crossover, and it's the promise of social mobility. Although I think in a lot of cases, it's proven to not work in the way that we have mythologized in the past.
Yeah, well, that thank you for running with that. I just wanted to throw that out there. And then Pete, back to you. When we last talked in the fall, we were talking about HR issues, and you brought up unions. So tell us about unions in the UK and any interaction between them and the working clubs.
Yeah, it was. So the unions of the working men's clubs were kind of parallel movements for working class people to organise and get together, and there's so much crossover between them. There was an interesting difference, which is that the unions obviously started off from this is no criticism of unions whatsoever, but they start off as having an antagonistic position with capital. It was like, in order for us to gain rights, you need to lose something. If you're going to pay us more, it's going to cost you more. And with the entire power of the state vested against them, until the 1870s, you could be around the 1830s. You could be imprisoned for trying to be a member of a union, for trying to unionise, and it wasn't until the 1880s that unions were recognised legally under British law. And the thing about the Working Men's Club movement was it was organised by a well-meaning middle-class clergyman, and he worked with the establishment, and he made it quite a fashionable cause and that actually served them very well. So for a little while, unions performed a lot better than for a little while the clubs performed a lot better than the unions because they had a little bit more establishment approval than the unions did, but both reached their peak at the same time. I grew up in the coal mining fields, as I said. The National Union of Mine Workers was the most dominant union in the country, and going back to what I think Dave was talking about earlier, at the time Reagan smashed the unions in the States. Of course, his best buddy Margaret Thatcher was doing exactly the same thing in the UK, and she precipitated a miners' strike. And if the miners had won that, it would have brought down the Conservative government. So she planned it. She stockpiled coal. She brought in coal that was mined basically under slavery conditions from apartheid South Africa. She had the police basically doing stop and search of miners. Our movement restricted. People were being spied on. Mail was being intercepted. A friend of mine, well, not a friend, but a guy I was at school with, we knew that he joined the army. And he was spotted on picket lines during the strike dressed as a policeman. So the army was being drafted in to masquerade as police. And the unions were shattered at pretty much the same time the clubs went into decline. So when the union's power was broken, industry disappeared. You no longer had that cohesive, collective sense of community. And so people stopped going to the clubs. And the decline of clubs pretty much mirrors the decline of the unions. And it's, if you look at clubs as the kind of social aspect and unions as the work aspect, it was a very close parallel between the two.
Wow. Well, that's a great intro. And I know Clubland's coming out still in June. I've got my pre-order in, and I cannot wait to read it.
Thank you very much. It's an extraordinary story because it started off with, this thing about the Licensing Act and the chicken in a basket and the cheap beer and the famous acts that played there. And the more I dug into it, the more this story became a story of working class self-definition, working class emancipation, and that's why I think it ties in really nicely with the conversation we've been having about unions.
Well, thanks so much. And it does resonate in this country, like from what we talked about last time, Gerard. I do know these clubs, the Italian Club, the Elks Club, they started as working people's clubs, and they've evolved, and the clubs still own their properties, in cities and other places. Big thanks to everybody. I've got a story about unions. A friend of mine who is older and he has a PhD. He started off 100 years ago. His grandfather was a Cuban immigrant, and he worked in a cigar factory that was a union, or at least had good conditions in New York City. And he just said what was great about it is they had paid readers who would sit while the workers were rolling cigars. They'd read them the news and literature, which seems like when you think about what a union should be, it seems like it's about giving you a decent work condition. So thanks so much for enlightening us, Gerard, right, for Good Beer Hunting and other things, and Dave Infante, editor and publisher of It's Fingers, of which I am a subscriber. Thank you, Dave. And Pete Brown, author of Clubland. You guys have been great. Last words from anybody, or we're going to sign off?
Get yourself a union beer.
Yeah, get a union beer, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And you got a list up there, too. So thanks so much, guys. We'll catch you next time. Thanks to Armin, our engineer, and Alex, our producing intern. We'll catch you next time on Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. All right, guys. Woo! Thank you. Beer Sessions Radio is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.